So I'm Virginia Lucas. I'm the curator and archaeologist down at the Lost City Museum. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a zooarchaeologist, meaning I do animal bones from archaeological sites. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the museum and some of our exhibits there and the history of all of that. But before that, um, just a little bit more about me. I'm from Tennessee originally, and my family, because of your Facebook Live video, is actually joining in on the talk tonight, so they'll actually get to see me as well. So, and I'm a photographer, so you'll actually see some of my photos in a little bit as well. So, with that, we'll get started with the early days of Pueblo Grande de Nevada. So, if you'll go in and hit. So, where we're talking about, most of y'all know because you're part of the Friends of Gold Butte, where we're talking about. So Moapa Valley is where the museum is. That's considered the lowland Virgin Branch region of the ancestral Puebloan, or Anasazi is the other term. You also have sites over in the St. George Basin, and then in the upland region. So down there, consider where Mount Trumbull and Mount Dellenbaugh, and the Shivwitz Plateau, the Uinkaret Plateau, and all of that. So those three groups were connected. And so, but my research is strictly in the lowland region. So next slide. So that site, Pueblo Grande de Nevada, it's been known for a while. So in 1827, Jedediah Smith was reaching out to the superintendent of Indian Affairs, talking about sites in the Moapa Valley. He collected items from the Paiute camps, was shown salt caves on the lower Virgin River, and so documented these things. But it wasn't until the 1920s that it really came to the forefront. So next slide. So in 1922-ish, Governor James Scrugham sent out a call about asking for archaeological sites in southern Nevada, because archaeology in the 1920s was pretty huge, because 1922, King Tut had just been discovered, November of 1922. Actually, the anniversary of the opening in 1923 was just like a couple of days ago of the inner part of the tomb. And tourism in Las Vegas, not what it is today, in 1922. So two brothers by the name of John and Faye Perkins reached out with like, hey, we have Puebloan ruins down here in Moapa Valley. So Governor Scrugham sent Mark Harrington, who is an archaeologist with the Southwest Museum, to Moapa. So sent him to Overton. And John and Faye are walking around and showing him around, and he's finding pottery sherds on the ground. And they're like, oh, don't worry about that stuff. We'll show you the better stuff. So he showed them where the actual big site of Pueblo Grande de Nevada was. And then he knew he had a site to excavate. And so they started excavations from 1924 to 1926. And then with that, because they knew that these excavations, there was a lot of material. Fast forward a little bit to the 1930s with the New Deal programs and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So they were building the Hoover Dam, or Boulder Dam. And they pulled them off that to build the museum. And so excavations continued up until we entered into World War II. So, and then as we'll get on with this, excavations kind of stopped for a little while. And then I think she excavated 1979, 78. Margaret Linus did some work out there. And then Dr. Karen Hari in the mid-2000s did work out there as well. So research is ongoing. So next slide. So these are a lot of just old photos that we have. This is Mark Harrington here on the right, and that's Governor James Scrugham, so who kind of jump-started this whole thing. So next slide. So when this was found, this got published in all kinds of newspapers. And in the next one, we're not going to move yet. It was all over. It went coast to coast, and it was like a city found, lost city, a city the size of Chicago, found in the Nevada desert. Let's see, 7 foot tall, red-haired giants were found with silken robes. No, they weren't. There were no giants. There was no silk found there. And so Harrington, to his credit, did actually try to publish, like, no, this really wasn't the case. It was a big site, but no, not to that extent. But as we, know with media, it even in 1924, like, it just grew like crazy. All right, so next slide, please. So this is just some of the early excavations. So in the early part of these early 1920s excavations, they moved a lot of dirt. They moved a lot. Now, standards for excavation, very different than what we do today. We meticulously map, and we do have some maps here, but not to what we do now. We screen like crazy. Most of the time in the 1920s and 1930s especially, you're really going for the big stuff. And even some of those prevailing thoughts kind of exist elsewhere, and one of the sites I worked at, I've kind of worked all over, back in Tennessee, Florida, but also Romania. And they didn't screen until we found like one thing. And then we had one of the guys make a screen. So we had one single screen for this huge site. So that was kind of the case here too. Like they did some screening, but not to a huge extent. All right, next slide, please. So these are just some photos showing what the foundations. Our pueblos down at Pueblo Grande de Nevada are single story. Most of you maybe are familiar with like Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Point of Pines down in Arizona, Wupatki in Arizona. All of those are multi-story pueblos. These are not. Primarily because they're mud brick, essentially, like they were mud, like adobe. Not as much stone like they had there. And population throughout Moapa Valley was not what the population was there. At the largest pueblo here in the Moapa Valley, like 100, 150 rooms, maybe. Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, you're talking like 800 rooms. So there's a big size difference there. And one of the things they had here was these double walls on here. So it's for insulation. So summertime helps with keeping it just a tad cooler. Same with pit houses. And winter keeps it just a little bit warmer. Next slide, please. So here we go. So all of this with these reports led up to 1925 with the Lost City Pageant that we'll talk about here in just a second. But what I found interesting with this, one of the big prevailing thoughts initially was that corn in this region came from east, from like the Kayenta region, so over in northern Arizona. But the early settlers to Moapa, and they even had some evidence of it just on the with excavations, did irrigation trenches. And there was a student at UNLV a few years ago now, about probably 15 years ago or so, almost 20, that looked at all the corn cobs from a single site in the Moapa Valley, and found that they closely matched to corn that came out of southern Arizona in the Holcomb region near Phoenix, which makes sense with the irrigation because Holcomb farmers had massive irrigation canals. So, people here absolutely could have figured this out on their own, but if you've got somebody that's already doing that, it's an easier way. So I put this one in here because that one from Seward, Alaska is dated to 1925, and they talk about the irrigation canals in there. Again, the Chicago was built in Nevada 1,500 years ago. It was pretty big. Like there was even some international press, Canada, but still it's international. as well. So that's pretty big. All right, next slide. And it was so big that there was a pageant. And actually, I'm going to plug the museum here. On April 11th, I'm going to be giving another, basically this, so you've already seen it, but we're opening an exhibit dedicated to the pageant and then showing some of the artifacts. This pageant was so big that they built a train station at St. Thomas for this. And so we found most of these photos actually came from me cleaning off my desk one day and found this CD that had photos. I had no idea. I'd been there, like, and my desk wasn't crazy messy. It wasn't like, it was like piled high with stuff. But we found these and it's like, oh, there's a lot of cool pictures here. And so this is how this kind of came about. And these were some of them. And you can see on the photo over there, the line of cars waiting to drive over to St. Thomas for this pageant. All right, next slide. So they had round trip excursions with Union Pacific Railroad going from Vegas, $3.75, which don't we wish that's what it would cost now? But this pageant was so big. There's conflicting numbers. Some say as many as 12,000 people. Most likely it was around like 5,000 to 6,000, but that's a lot of people for St. Thomas. For a little bitty town in the middle of nowhere, to have that many people kind of descend on it to watch this. Next slide. So what this pageant was there was the history of man, basically, in Nevada. So this was actually just the building of the pueblos that were out there. And they had hired members of the Zuni Nation to come out here and do this and dance as well. And so they're the ones who built the pueblos. So next slide. And then here's some of their, the dancers. There were also members of the Moapa Band of Paiute that were there telling their history as well. And honestly, as a photographer, seeing these and how crisp and clear these are is pretty awesome, because this one it's like you zoom in and it's still like nice and clear and crisp. Next slide. So this is just looking from the backside, looking up towards the stage site. And so, like I said, they had Zuni members enacting, they had Moapa Band, they had members of Overton out here as well. Lots of people that put on this pageant. Next slide. And just milling around. You can see Nevada written up on top there. I always found it interesting. I would love to count them, the stars on the flag, because obviously this is pre-50 states too. So few stars less. But it was just a big group of folks out here. Next slide. So this one is one of my favorites. So if anybody's been to the museum in the last couple of years, you might have seen the exhibit that we have to Willis Evans. So Willis Evans was a Pitt River native that often worked with Mark Harrington. Mark Harrington was kind of ahead of his time, really, for who he hired for his crew, because he always wanted a native person on his crew for excavations, because this land belonged to them. And in this case, he hired Willis Evans. In 2020, so it was right after, I guess it was right before the shutdown with everything, we had Willis's grandson come in with a cradle board and was asking if we could do a long-term loan for it so we would keep it, because it was starting to fall apart, because it's also over 100 years old. And because it was made in 1896, I want to say. And so we said, sure. And he wanted an exhibit around it, because prior to this exhibit, there was one single picture labeled Willis Evans in the museum. And Willis had done it quite a bit. And so we were like, well, it's kind of hard to make an exhibit out of one artifact. So we incorporated Willis's life. And so all of that being said, comes back to these two photos. And we didn't know until we debuted the exhibit that we actually were incorrect, because in the book, The Lost City, It's labeled wrong. That picture there was labeled as George Evans, which is correct, but it was labeled as Willis's brother. It was actually his father. So, and that was the one who made the cradle board that we have. And so it was kind of cool as I'm going through these other photos of finding this one. And I'm like, wait, that's George, because I'm looking at the body paint and the face paint, and it's the exact same. And so he's actually sitting on a rabbit fur blanket that he likely made or somebody close to him. And it's just a really, like tying it all back together. Next slide. This is Willis. The family approached us with a negative for that slide or that photo that I ended up turning it back into a picture, but then found this and then found this one on that as well. So he enacted, if you come to the museum, if you've ever seen the picture of the guy in the front gallery holding an atlatl, so the spear thrower, that's him. So, and then the salt caves too. Next slide. Okay, so this next little bit is like a 2-minute clip of the pageant, like little bits and pieces. So this actually comes from, so back in 2008, Dr. Karen Hari created what was called the Finder's Guide for the Pueblo Grande de Nevada. So basically tracking every artifact that came out of there, the museum that it was at, pictures of it, all of that stuff. And so and any sort of correspondence too. And in there's a clip from the University of South Carolina, of all places, that they found what was called a blooper reel of the pageant. We still have never been able to track down the actual pageant. There is a copy somewhere that has been documented, but nobody knows where it is. So if we'll go on and play this, and it is a silent film, so I might talk a little bit because I feel awkward standing up here for 3 minutes, just standing here. So it's some of this, it starts out, you can see like how vast this landscape is, because you'll actually see people walking on here. It's showing, it's not going to show excavations. The original film does show excavations, and they were showing a burial excavation, but due to being respectful, we don't show the native skeletons. And then this is the actual pageant. One of the things we've been trying to do, and I've reached out to the Pueblo of Zuni to try to figure out who these folks are, if we can put names to them. Haven't heard back. We're going to reach out to the Moapa band as well, because at the end here, you'll see a little kid in a cradle board. So that kid's probably no longer with us, but likely, descendants of these folks are, and hopefully there's some sort of record of them. But I also love how they switch between scenes, the hand over the camera lens. And I was hoping that we would have George on here, but we don't. I've watched this several times, hoping I'll catch the body paint and the face paint of him, but we don't. And it's funny because early on with the hats, as baskets, people didn't realize that those were actual hats instead of baskets. But that was what they wore as head coverings. I do wish it had sound though, because that would be pretty cool to hear. But unfortunately, it doesn't. So yeah, she's got the cradle board there, and then there's they'll have her like propped up basically, as well as she's grinding probably corn or mesquite maybe. So yeah. Honestly, I have no idea. No clue. Because this is like because we haven't seen like the full thing, so we don't know really. I would say for probably in this case, probably not, because there was probably poor performance. All right, next slide. All right, so that's those 1924 to 26. So that pageant actually took place over 2 years, and that's why we're opening this exhibit in April, because it's the 100th anniversary of the second pageant, which also had a rodeo as part of it, which was interesting. But let's fast forward to the 1930s. So Civilian Conservation Corps comes to Nevada, building the Hoover Dam. At this point, Governor Scrugham, no longer governor. This is a few years in the future. So he actually lost re-election because his opponent really used the let's have live cities, not dead ones, basically, because he was so focused on the past and people didn't like that. So, but by this point he was in Congress, and he's one of the big reasons we have Valley of Fire State Park. Also, he pushed for that, and then pushed because he knew what was where Lake Mead is now, where there's sites there. So his pushing pulled crews off of the building of the dam to excavate. So next slide. So this is them just coming in, arriving in Nevada. We actually, a lot of folks stayed. Like two of the big companies were from Ohio that were here, but we had a lot that ended up staying and putting down roots in Overton. And one of the pictures here in a minute is it's kind of the iconic photo of the museum, but we talked to the guy's son who weirdness ended up being sort of related to one of my coworkers at the museum. All right, next slide. So this is just some more of the foundation. So Pueblo Grande de Nevada was not a single pueblo. It was several pueblos, multiple pueblos. And you can kind of see them all laid out. And one of the big hallmarks of the Moapa Valley and the pueblos in Moapa is they're C-shaped, where in a lot of other places, not so much. So they were C-shaped, so as they added onto them, they would add on the ends, and then ultimately it would potentially enclose completely. All right, next slide. This is some of the dirt. This is a foundation at the base of that. 10 feet of sand that they went through. And apparently Mark Harrington had quite the knack of being able to tell which sand dunes actually had a pueblo under it and which ones were just sand dunes. Like, he could do that quite well. But Mark Harrington, so real quick, I forgot one little thing that I always thought was quite interesting, especially as an archaeologist. When he first went out there, he gathered some of those sherds, those pottery sherds, and took them to an archaeologist in New Mexico who said there are no Puebloan ruins that far west, because at this time, ancestral Puebloans were not thought to be this far west. The archaeologist in New Mexico threw those sherds in the trash. And Mark Harrington was like, I beg to differ, picked them up, and then, made his way back home. One of the big drawbacks with Harrington, though, I will say, he never published his stuff. 1961, somebody did publish Harrington's notebooks, compiled them, but Harrington never published his own stuff. So you're kind of piecing together. All right, next slide. So this is just a shot of some of the CCC boys. Let's see. Faye Perkins is there sitting with his leg, not the guy on the end, but the one next to him, and then Willis is sitting right next to him. Those are the only two I know in this. But it's just a nice little group shot out there at Pueblo Grande de Nevada. Next slide. Okay, so this next bit, we've got two more films. So this part here is the reason that this talk exists. We thought this was the Lost City pageant because it was in a film reel case labeled Lost City, but unfortunately it's not. But it's still really cool. It is excavations, and you'll see Willis Evans walking. You're going to see Mark Harrington. They used to take people out there to it so they could see what everything looked like. And we realized at the end of it um, that it was essentially like a kind of reminded me like a CCC propaganda film, like what good the CCC did, which they did amazing work. Um, so I think that's kind of what this was done for. And then Willis was supervising the excavations. He was the CCC foreman, and then ultimately Mark Harrington actually sent him to school for archaeology. So being a native person with a essentially college education too was pretty awesome. So these are just showing some of the foundations that we had that are out there. And some of this ended up underwater. Some did not, because some was up on a ridge, while others were further closer down to where water level would be. And Mark Harrington has some of the best boots in this that I love his boots. It was 3 or 4 years, I think, a couple of years before it got all the way back to there, because that's pretty far back. Like if you've been there to Lake Mead coming in from the north side, so it's on up past Overton Beach. So House 47 that's mentioned here is one that Dr. Karen Hari, that's the one she went back and actually excavated again. And I think it was like 2008 or 9. You can see the fingerprints down on the mud brick right there. I love that this was done in like that, silent film type too. And then there's misspellings with 96 as opposed to 96. And we've actually had Willis Evans's family down as well, and they've now seen this. So seeing their grandfather walking is pretty cool because he had died before most of the grandkids were ever born. And I love this. You'll end up seeing a dog run here in just a second behind there. So should be, yeah, there he goes, a little Cocker Spaniel. The people dressed up to go out to the desert to check out some ruins. So I left this in here. You're not going to see the burial, but this is going to come into play when I talk, when we get to the end of this, about some of my ongoing research. Next slide. And so people were buried in the floor of the Pueblo. Like that was pretty common. And that's pretty common, like kind of across the board in a lot of places. So these are just more photos. You can see like how big these walls are as they're getting, digging down in there and just moving tons and tons of dirt. Next slide. So they also, while the 1930s excavations, again, like I said, standards in the 20s and 30s, not what we have today as far as recording, but they still did record. So this guy down here, James Oken, that was kind of part of his job, was like keeping track of all of those artifacts that came out of the ground. And there was a lot. There was a whole lot. And I put these two in because until I had names for these, I could have sworn those were the same people. Because their faces, their mouth, their smile look almost identical, but completely different names. So I don't even think they're related, but they look it. So, and then I found his name, Oken's name, and it's like, oh, well, I guess you're not related to McDonald, but it was hopeful. All right, next slide. And this is the second half of that, second part of that film. So this is Willis and Harrington excavating a little bit, doing photography, and also I think even that early they did have transit stations, total station type things where you could take readings and everything. And I love this where like Willis is the one clearing off most of it, and then Harrington's the one who actually takes the last little bit and holds it for the first time. This little bitty pot. And Harrington actually worked all over. He was from the East Coast, worked Florida before making his way out here. This right here, for the longest time, we were all pretty certain that those pueblos out there at the pageant site were complete replicas. But reading that and then looking kind of at the base here, it looks like they might have been built on the foundation of a previous pueblo because it said they were replicated on there. So we don't know because these are destroyed. These are no longer here whatsoever. Um, I love this next little bit, and we can tell this was like the 10 years or so at least after the pageant. And I would also love to know what he's like chiseling, but we don't have no idea. Um, but they're digging out these pueblos, and you can see there's quite a bit of sand in there as well. And then this is what made us think that it was like a thing, like just really promoting what the CCC did. Because the CCC, obviously, they didn't just work here. There was another group called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Both of those groups were responsible for a lot of the archaeological excavations that happened in the 30s. Back Tennessee, Oklahoma, some of the big mound sites back there were excavated by the WPA. So CCC was pretty cool. So next slide. All right. So at this point, you have a lot of artifacts, and you need a place to put those because you don't want them to get any more damage than they were when you pulled them out of the ground. So next slide. So this was the breaking ground of the Boulder Dam Park Museum. So they broke ground on December 12th, 1934, handmade over 70,000 adobe bricks, and is open to the public in July of 1935. So last year was our 90th anniversary. So next slide. So we have this picture in the museum. It's one of my favorites because I'm not going to lie. When I first started working there, I actually thought those were rows of crops. Behind him, those are bricks being baked. So, but it kind of looks like crops growing. If you're, and our lighting in the museum is not that great. We're getting that fixed. So it was hard to see. That's my excuse. But then you realize, no, those are bricks, and you can see them over here too. But yeah, 70,000 of these were made. Next slide. So this is one of I would love to have this blown up and just hanging in my office because I just love this picture. The front room of the museum is the original museum. The sandstone there is sandstone that they trucked in from Valley of Fire and laid it down. It also had where their office is now, but it had a whole like apartment. There was a park ranger because in 1935 we were federal. We were part of the Park Service, and then in 1950, Park Service or federal government Park Service pulled out, and we almost became a county institution until ultimately the state took it over like 1953-ish. And that's when we went from Boulder Dam Park Museum to the Lost City Museum. So next slide. And so this is that photo I was telling you about. So the guy up here on this end with the hat is Ralph McCreary. We're pretty certain because that's the son that I talked to that came in. He gave me a jump drive of a ton of photos, and there's other pictures of him, and he was wearing that style of cap and standing kind of with that like body language. So we're pretty certain that's who that is. But we have this one up in the museum, actually in a couple of places, because it's kind of like our iconic photo of the museum. You can see Boulder Dam Park right there. All right, next slide. These are the pueblos in the back. Those get actually remudded every year because that mud cracks, and so they'll go out and remud them because rain and mud don't really mix when you have a mud brick house. But these were built in 35, so we're actually part of the National Historic Register as well. So it kind of limits sometimes things that we can do and changes we can make because we're on that National Historic Register. All right, next slide. So this was still the early days here. So still you can see Boulder Dam Park Museum. And this is when you can see a door right there. That was actually the old bathroom. There's if you look, you can see where they've covered all the brick with adobe, so it's just a solid piece now. But you can see the wood, the beam up top that would show the door. So there's one on one side and then one on the other for the men's and women's restroom. So that way you didn't go inside to the residence of the park ranger. And so now obviously the bathrooms are indoors completely. So next slide. This is just looking out the front door. I'm honestly really glad it no longer has window panes because it faces west. And it's pretty miserable actually when the door opens in the afternoon, especially in the summer, and you get blasted with that sun. Yeah. But I still think it would be kind of cool to have the windows, the panes in there too. And what they did, so Mark Harrington had a huge hand in designing this place. And when it got kind of redone with the cabinets that we have now, they really tried to kind of keep that same vibe that Mark Harrington had, with making it more educational instead of hey, look at this stuff. You kind of learn about the stuff instead. So next slide. This is when, even though the name hasn't changed, this is actually when it went to state control. So this is 1950s. So Faye Perkins with Willis Evans here, and then on the end, Mark Harrington there on the right, and then Faye Perkins over there. And I actually had tried to fix this, but the coloration, they were completely washed out, so you couldn't really fix the photo. Because I was trying to at least make it where you could distinguish between his head and the sky, but I couldn't. But yeah, the name itself and the sign didn't actually appear until later on in the 50s, even though the name had changed, it just hadn't been changed on the sign yet. All right, next slide. All right, so all this is going on. Dam's built. But St. Thomas still is out there. By this point, the last residents have been told to leave because they're going to get covered in water. And the Pageant site too. Next slide. You can see the water. And so the Pageant, the Pueblo itself actually did end up underwater. And they no longer exist because, again, standing water, mud brick, doesn't really, doesn't make for good preservation. All right, next slide. And this is another one. This might even be once it had come out from the water, because it's like the town of St. Thomas has actually been in and out of the water 8 different times since the initial flooding in the 1930s. Now it's out probably for good, since you can actually go out there, hike around, and all of that. All right, next slide. And so the museum today, if you'll hit next slide, looks like this. I do miss where you can see the individual bricks. If you walk along the side, you can see it, and actually inside there, because we added that extension, that wing in the back, you can see on the back side of that, which would have been the back door of the museum, the individual bricks as well. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to get into my stuff, because you always wonder, do people still research? Absolutely. So I got really lucky when this job of curator popped up back in 2018. And would you know, my area of expertise and area of focus is the Moapa Valley. So I get paid to do my research, which is really nice. But we have other people too. So, like a couple of the sites I've used for my dissertation are actually held by the museum. So anything I do there is going to only benefit the museum itself. But we've had a guy, his name is Danny Perez, who does pottery. And he came and looked at all of our painted vessels, trying to get an idea of identity with people throughout the Virgin Branch region. All right, so next slide. So again, where I work is this area. So Pueblo Grande de Nevada is actually down here where it says Main Ridge. And so most of our sites throughout the Moapa are along the Muddy River, because that's a river that really never dries up. The Virgin River, it's reliant on snow melt and rainfall. And so the Virgin is coming down on that side of the mesa. And there's a handful of sites all the way up. But along the Muddy, all the way up there to where Bovine Bluff and Black Dog Archaeological Complex are, there's about 300 at least documented sites along there. Because even in drought, the Muddy River has water. So, next slide. So the time period my research goes for, what I'm looking at is a change in subsistence, change in what they ate. Or was there one? From first time, people being there all the way up through abandonment, which I'm not quite to abandonment because my sites end at Pueblo 2. So in the Moapa, you're looking at Basket Maker 2 up here. So that says 500 BC to 500 AD, but reality earliest dates are about 1 AD. So we know people were there before, but as far as like truly occupied, it's about 1 AD in that region. So I'm looking at Basket Maker 2, 3, and then Pueblo 1 and 2. And then as far as for the rest of the valley, this area was abandoned by about 1250 by the Puebloans. It's one of those things we still don't know what really happened. Did they assimilate with the Paiute, who had come in about 1200? Did they move east into the Kayenta region? Did they move south? Part of it is that the thought of actually what happened at Gold Butte, the kind of disrupting of the trade routes there kind of disrupted the population here and caused them to move on. It's one of those things we're probably never going to know the answer unless somebody can invent a time machine. And, we can go back and see. So next slide. So the sites I looked at, we've got Black Dog Cave, Yamashita 1, Black Dog Mesa, Steve Perkins, Bovine Bluff, and Yamashita 3, and then Adam 2. And a couple of these, Yamashita 3 is a multi-component site, meaning that they're in 2 different time periods. Same with Steve Perkins. There was an early occupation at Basket Maker 3, and then there was a later occupation in the Pueblo 2. Next slide. Okay, one more. So this is just photos because it's just going to be me talking about it for right now. So Basket Maker 2, primarily what they ate, tortoise and the desert cottontail. Didn't really have much as far as bighorn sheep or anything. Now, part of this, they could have been eating those, but bone preservation here is terrible. So we might not have it. So with what I have, this is what I was able to come up with. Desert tortoise throughout all 4 of these time periods, huge part of the diet. All right, next slide. So Basket Maker 3, though, a little bit later, we move into having mule deer, which is interesting because mule deer are not native down there in the valley itself. They'd have to be up on the mesa or trading with some of the groups up in the upland region on the plateaus. And we know at Pueblo Grande de Nevada, one of the things that Mark Harrington documented was elk antler. We definitely don't have elk down here. So anywhere close, really, that would be easy to get to. So what we think, one of the things I'm looking at, or one of my thoughts, is it also points to seasonality. So these animals, like the deer and the elk, would actually be from the fall. because that would be pine nut harvest. And pine nuts, that's where you would have the higher elevations with those animals. Desert tortoise, also they're brumating in the winter. They're only out really in spring and fall. Like summer, they're kind of also not out as much. Bighorn are around all the time. We also have, in the Pueblo II period, I have birds that winter here. So it kind of points to season, like occupied sites throughout all 4 seasons. Rabbits, so desert cottontail points to overall occupation. So the more cottontails you have, the likely more mobile people are, because they're not clearing the land. When you get into having a lot of the black-tailed jackrabbits, because of how they move, you catch them by nets. And so that's usually a sedentary people. So they do rabbit drives. And they even do this, like this was even into the historic times. This is a big like social gathering. People would go around moving to different groups at these big rabbit drives. All right, next slide. So again, back to no deer in these, but again, I can't stress enough how much the desert tortoise was used. It's like a crazy amount. And some of the early research had these in there, but not to the extent that I do, because being as an archaeologist, and the folks that were doing that really weren't, and not just, saying anything bad about them. Where I'm from, my master's and my bachelor's thesis was on sites in Florida. And I've looked at, in my Florida stuff, I had 19 different species of turtles and tortoises. So I'm able to differentiate the different parts of the shell better than just saying tortoise. So, and doing that, you can get more accurate numbers too. So like if you have overlap, you can get that number down quite a bit better. Next slide. And then finally, into the Pueblo II. So the Pueblo II period, heyday of population, the biggest amount of population that you have. So you're going to have, there's actually more, there's dogs, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. You have domestic dogs, you've got the birds that I was talking about. We had fish too during the Pueblo II period, and pretty big fish at that are found in the Muddy River. All right, next slide. All right, it's my other research project. So one of my favorite things are dog burials. They're pretty spectacular. Moapa Valley has a lot more per amount of people than a lot of other places. And so next slide. So again, we can go through this one. Next slide. Okay, so I used Mark Harrington's notes, and I can only go by his notes. So if he labeled them as dogs, that's what I had to go by. Most likely, people are not going to be burying coyotes with somebody. So dogs, pretty standard. So we had sites, Burial Hill, Adam 2, the Yamashita sites, a site called either Anasazi 1 or the Lewis site, which is at 2036, Park Perkins site 3, Mesa House, which is an interesting site, and then down here at Main Ridge and Pueblo Grande de Nevada. So next slide. Okay, so when I said there's a lot, we had, that was not like that on mine. We had a total of 278 burials at Pueblo Grande de Nevada. And quite a few of those had dogs with them. And in some cases with juveniles, multiple dogs. There was one like kid that had 2 dogs, 2 puppies. That it was so well preserved that there was yellow dog hair with it too. Like you could tell what color the dog was. And through next slide, yeah, this was the rest of the Moapa Valley. So they all total there was about 30 dog burials, which that's a lot. Like I know that doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot. when usually, like my friend works in southern New Mexico in the Mimbres region, and in all the sites that she's excavated there, she's come across 3. So having this many is quite a bit. One of the interesting ones, next slide. Yeah. So this is actually Mark Harrington's notes, his little drawing. This one was done, the infant was at the base of the grave, obviously. Then up above it, with it looking in, was a dog burial. At the site of Mesa House, which was one of those on that map, in the big room of the Pueblo, the person was buried in the middle of the floor, which is pretty standard. The dog was actually buried in the wall, was put into the wall overlooking this room, and actually had a mono buried with it too. So what I'm thinking is that these were likely put in as guardians for the people. So with the infants, because also having dogs or anything with infants is pretty unusual, because usually it's not till you hit adolescence and older that you would actually have objects placed with you with burials. So next slide. These last 2 are just, because I can't show you the actual photo. When I presented this at the Society for American Archaeology meeting, I had to do a line drawing, so I did this with Photoshop, because they don't want you to show the actual photos. So this one, it's hard to see. It's actually one of my favorite pictures. The individual is laying face down. And most of these dogs are probably, just knowing what type of dogs were here, probably in that 30 to 40 pound range. So not very big. This one though, this individual was laying face down. The dog's head was right up here on his hip, and the back of his legs were down at his ankles. That's a big dog when you think about it. And so obviously, what I would think is it's a pretty revered animal. Yes, I don't know why he's face down. No clue. One of the sites that we have in Middle Tennessee is actually, it's a 6,000-year-old site, and there's a female. And it's one of the best pictures I've ever seen too, and unfortunately, the people, when they buried her, probably killed the dog, because this dog was elderly, and this lady probably took care of it. And so when she died, probably nobody else wanted to take care of it. But what they did when they buried it with her, they wrapped it around her back, tucked its head over her shoulder, and then put its paw under her arm. And I'm like, I get chills every time I talk about it, because it's like they knew that she, that was her dog. Next slide. So last one, you can see person also still kind of buried face down, but kind of angled. And then you can see the dog right here, up kind of on a shelf, essentially above the person. So next slide, and I think that's it. Oh, I just told you, what were domestic dogs used for? Likely probably guarding. There's no evidence that they were eaten, like in some places. None of the dog burials that I have cut marks on any part of the bone. So, and just knowing where they were with people, and seeing on the Mesa House plan view, like if you come to the museum, I'll be happy to show it. We have the plan view, the map of Mesa House, so I can show you on that map where the dog is versus where the burial is, which is really cool. So next slide. So the end. It did end up doing like it should have. It was supposed to go the other way and do it like that, where you didn't see that. So I've got that with the ... because research is ongoing. We're still finding out stuff. And then final slide is the acknowledgments. And so we actually did it like this because, again, this was done in that whole like old movie style. So I had a scrolling thing here. So any questions? Yeah.
When you found that they also have fish, were they fossil bones or were they?
No, these are like from, well, 900 years ago, but recent. And because one of my thoughts was, where was this found in the excavation, like which level. And so looking at excavation notes, so this was from the Steve Perkins site. This was excavated back in the 70s, 72, I think, 73, something like that, 1970s. And so the level that those fish bones came from was about a foot to a foot and a half down. So I know that they were archaeological and not just a surface find. So, and it's a type of fish that's found in the Muddy River. So, and probably easy to catch.
And my other question
I'm sorry.
was, the Kaibab Plateau is not that
Right.
far away.
That's another part of the upland group.
Okay.
So there's several plateaus and I don't always get all of them out.
But I was just wondering if the deer would have
Potentially, because one of the things that after I finish my dissertation, which I'll defend this semester, and I'll be a doctor, which will be pretty cool. I want to look at maybe doing some what's called isotope testing on some of the like turkey or deer bones. You can't do it on the human skeletal remains because that's destructive testing. So you got to get permissions and everything for that, and that's fine. But we can do this on animal bone and see, like with turkeys, if people were domesticating them, were they coming from the plateaus? Because they're native up there. They're not native in the Overton. You can find them there now, but they were released in the 1970s for hunters. And so if the turkeys that we have signatures for the isotopes that point towards feeding them, so like feeding corn or something, likely they were being kept here. If they don't, and it's wild grasses that would be found up on the plateaus, then they were likely being traded down with other things when they went up, trading with folks in the upland region. Yeah. Yeah, probably not. They would have likely been killed with the person. So I know I'm a dog lover, but it was, different belief system. And if they're being used as a guardian, that's probably also would be a pretty big, pretty great thing, to have one with you. No, they could have, and there could have been like any, there's several different ways that you can euthanize something that won't leave a mark on the skeleton. So, and also there's no cut marks, but if something, I would, just throwing this out, I don't know if this is the case, if you bash something's head in, because of the way the preservation is, I'm not going to be able to tell that. Because one of the dogs I do have at the museum, when we preserve things at the museum, we try to keep things with museum standard. And this dog is most definitely not. It's in a styrofoam thing with cotton because I'm afraid to move it because if I do, it's going to fall apart. And it's also it's super fragile. So it could have been, killed by having its head bashed in. And I can't tell that because the skull is bashed in. So whether it was by somebody or, 1,000 years of, soil on top of it, it could go either way. Any other questions? I'm not doing any sort of excavations there at all. I know that the Las Vegas Water District has done some work. Nathan Harper has done some work there, and I know they have found some projectile points. I'm not sure about Pottery Church, though. Do you want to switch and take this one? That you can.
One at all. But thank you for asking. Virginia, thank you so much for coming out tonight and for enlightening us with all those. I love those old photos.
Thank you.
I have to say a couple things. I know in some Plains Indians cultures, I've heard, wasn't there, but that they will kill a horse so that the warrior can journey to the next.
I've not heard that, so I'm not sure.
And it's probably closer to your reality than mine because I read a lot of fantasy stuff. So
So I mean, but it very well could be too. Like but I don't research much on the plains because that's like
yeah,
out of my
right,
realm.
right.
So
And then the other thing is you mentioned the deer.
yes.
I saw two deer almost at the freeway
Oh,
going into Overton less than a year ago.
deer, not sheep.
Not sheep. No,
Huh.
I
I know there's my coworker had seen one, but and I questioned her a lot too because it's like they're not down there, and if there's like it's rare if they are
yeah,
because the elevation temperature it's too hot for mule deer. Like if you go on like up into Mount Charleston, you'll find deer up there,
yeah.
but you're not going to find them at the base at that turnoff.
No, and that's what's weird is because I was turning off the freeway coming into the valley and I looked over and I saw these two and I said, "Oh, bighorn sheep right by the highway. That's weird." And they both had antlers, not horns. So they were deer.
That's
And
interesting.
it was. I was like, "Really? Wow." So they said, "Oh dear." Uh, we
And Virgin Peak is
in Gold Butte.
okay.
Yeah.
So that I know at Gold Butte because I've actually seen the report for the faunal material that came out of there that there are deer bones there, and I think actually maybe even a couple of elk too. Because
Yeah, I've heard about elk. I've seen deer at Arrowhead Springs,
okay.
which is now Arrowhead Springs Nay Ranch. A friend of mine got married out there about
Oh.
10 years ago, and they put alfalfa around the outside to keep the deer from eating like
Oh.
the straw that we were sitting on for the ceremony.